2023 has been a year of great movies. You can take your pick on which one is the best: Barbie, Oppenheimer, Past Lives, and many more. But A24's The Iron Claw, about the tragedy of the famed Von Erich wrestling family, is one of the best of the year, and one of the most heartbreaking films you'll see in 2023, whether you're familiar with the story or not. Zac Efron and Jeremy Allen White are phenomenal as two of the Von Erich brothers, but as emotional as the film is, something big is missing. The Iron Claw covers the death of 4 Von Erich siblings, but another brother who died tragically, Chris Von Erich, is completely left out. He isn't mentioned once, as if he never existed. Director Sean Durkin has given his reasons for this, but no matter the excuse, it only adds to the heartbreak for a filmmaker to decide to omit part of a real-life tragedy, thus erasing the life and death of a man. Chris Von Erich deserves to be remembered. The story of the Von Erichs is almost too painful to be true. Under the guidance of their father, Fritz Von Erich, who created World-Class Championship Wrestling (WCCW) in Texas, the Von Erich brothers ruled the state. They were treated like rock stars by fans in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. As popular as they were, though, behind the scenes, a shattering story was playing out. Fritz Von Erich and his wife Doris had 6 sons. When all was said and done, only one, Kevin Von Erich, played by Efron, remained alive. The so-called Von Erich curse started in 1959, when 6-year-old Jack died in an accidental drowning. Decades later, in 1984, David Von Erich, now a popular wrestler, died on tour in Japan from acute enteritis. In 1987, Mike Von Erich overdosed on sleeping pills. In 1993, Kerry Von Erich, who had found fame in the WWF as the Texas Tornado, shot himself. The Iron Claw covers those deaths without being graphic and insensitive, but it leaves out the death of Chris. The life and death of Chris Von Erich is perhaps the most painful of all. His brothers were legends, muscular athletic specimens who fans looked at as if they were superheroes come to life. That burden was put on Chris as well, but he wasn't like his gifted siblings. Chris was only 5 feet 5 inches and 175 pounds. On top of his small stature, he had asthma and brittle bones from the prednisone he took for it. That only made him want to be a wrestler even more. As Kevin Von Erich told the Dallas Observer in 1997, during a tag team match with Kevin, Chris' brittle bones caved, and he broke his arm badly. It was too bad that it just wasn't to be for Chris. He had heart, though, Kevin recalled. Chris Von Erich wanted to be a wrestler, but his body wouldn't cooperate. In 1991, depression from his failed career and the deaths of his brothers, along with his physical pain, became too much to bear. In September 1991, he wrote a suicide note which included the lines, "It's nobody's fault. I'll be with my brothers." He then got high on cocaine and Valium, walked 100 yards from the family home, and shot himself. Chris was only 21. The Iron Claw does a commendable job in how it handles the deaths of the Von Erich brothers. We don't see them overdose or watch them place a gun to their head. Rather, we see the aftermath, with someone getting the news in a phone call or finding a body after the fact. The Iron Claw is an gory, sensationalist movie where the act of dying is the focus. It's the response to dying, how Kevin Von Erich, particularly, persevered and chose to live, that is the focal point. Missing from that, though, is the story of Chris Von Erich. It's not as if he's seen, but then his story is glossed over. No, he's not even brought up. In this world, he never was. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, director Sean Durkin revealed why he chose not to have Chris Von Erich in the Iron Claw. The smallest Von Erich was actually in the original screenplay, which Durkin also wrote, for 5 years. In the final script, Durkin took Chris out. He said there was a repetition to it, and it was one more tragedy that the film couldn't really withstand. I honestly don't know if it would have gotten made. Durkin admitted that on a human level, the decision to cut Chris Von Erich was an impossible choice. Still, he thought he had no choice but to remove his from the final draft because you have to make difficult choices to try and get to something truthful or representative or emotional that reflects the core of the journey you're choosing to tell within this family. The Iron Claw is all about brotherhood and the deep love the Von Erich boys had for each other. They loved each other so much that they couldn't take the loss of one another. In The Iron Claw, Kevin Von Erich speaks about his dream life involving living on a ranch with all of his brothers and their families. After Kerry dies, he envisions him in heaven with his brothers again. So, if that's the emotional core of the film, why leave one brother out? Yes, one more death would almost be too much, but that's part of the point. The Von Erich story is one of tragedy. We know what we're getting into when we sit down to watch The Iron Claw. How does a director decide that an audience can only handle so much of that tragedy? The Iron Claw is saying this is a story about brothers, but you're only going to be able to deal with so much of it, so we're cutting one out. That takes it from being its intent to a censored Hollywood creation. The Iron Claw is 130 minutes long. Chris Von Erich could have been added, and you'd still only have a movie that was perhaps only 20 minutes longer. More so, Chris Von Erich deserves to have his story told, maybe more than anyone. Chris wasn't forced into wrestling, but had a passion for it. He was the little underdog who wanted it so much but wasn't physically capable. What a powerful story that is. He died partially because he thought he wasn't good enough, that he couldn't measure up. 3 decades later, he is excluded and forgotten from a movie about his family, in a way almost proving his point.